Welcome back to Icon Coaching. My name's Kirk and I'm one of the coaches here.
The key is to get started.
In today's video, I want to show you how without us knowing it, something that is only unfamiliar can become evil. But let's start here. A lot of us in leadership get a vision for something new. We get an idea of how we want to change things up a bit, and we try to introduce change into our cultures. And we have to start that process by understanding all change is bad. Now that's not objectively true, but that's experientially true. And we got to qualify it just a little bit by saying all change that is beyond a certain size is bad. But when you're doing big change, you have to first understand that no matter how good an idea it is, no matter how much research you've done, no matter how right you are, all change is bad. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Let me create a continuum here on the board. And on one side, we'll say there are things that are good. And on the other side, we'll say there are things that are bad. And let's say on that continuum, you are right there. And surrounding that is a set of things that are your relative normal. Anything inside of that box is where your culture is comfortable with. It's called reasonable. Anything that moves you beyond that box is just bad. The culture doesn't know what to do with it. It's totally unfamiliar. It's unreasonable. And so as a result of that, it has its first response is to reject it. Let me give you a very specific example. Let's say your family culture is used to an income of $100,000 a year. Let's say that's kind of normal. And maybe one year you don't get a bonus or your commissions are lower, or for whatever reason, you drop down a little bit to $90,000. That's not fun. But it's not the end of the world, and we can survive that. A few little adjustments here and there, and we'll make it up next year, and it's fine. Or let's say you move up to $110,000. Again, it's within the realm of normal. However, what we know about how money and families work is if all of a sudden you go from making $100,000 a year way up here to making $1 million a year, that is a radical change. And objectively, that's better. You've moved up the scale in the good. But it's such a big change that it can cause all kinds of stress and friction. Marriages can start to fracture a little bit. Friend groups don't know quite how to relate to you anymore. You have to make a whole bunch of new decisions, and it can be a little bit difficult. Now, objectively, it's good, but subjectively, that change is just bad. Or we might say hard or difficult. Now, when you acclimate to it, you end up with a new culture that is now oriented around that kind of income. But that takes time. And when you make one of these changes fast, it's just bad. The same is true if you work down here and let's say you go from making $100K to $10K a year. Again, radical change towards the bad. And of course, most of us would agree it's bad. What we're trying to show here is that there is a relative normal, and that normal defines the good. And any move outside of it is just bad. When you're trying to do significant cultural change or significant cultural upgrades, trying to introduce new strategies, new softwares, new organizational structures, when you're trying to do any of that kind of work, and you're making the case that it's good and necessary, needs to be done, you have to also know that the culture itself will experience it as bad and resist it. It may not even want to. It's just the natural process. How does that happen? How does a relative normal become so powerful that when you try to change into something that is objectively good, it can be experienced as bad? And I'll show you that. It's very, very simple. Here's how it starts. As you first start to do anything, you will develop a culture, and that culture will be developed around things that you become familiar with. And the opposite of familiar is unfamiliar. And this tension right here is kind of innocuous. Yeah, I'm familiar with this, and I'm unfamiliar with that, but it doesn't really matter. It's just a familiarity thing. But given enough time, and it sometimes isn't very long at all, familiar elevates to normal. And the opposite of normal is abnormal. And abnormal has a little tinge of something to it, doesn't it? You don't really want to be abnormal, but given enough time, normal becomes reasonable. And the opposite of reasonable is unreasonable. You don't want to be in a meeting where you present an idea and it's considered unreasonable. You don't want to be told, stop being unreasonable. Unreasonable is clearly something to be avoided. And reasonable is good. Reasonable has this era of rightness about it. And that's the next step. Given enough time, reasonable becomes right. And the opposite of right is wrong. And that is where you introduce the beginning of moral language. Above this line, we're literally talking about morality now, right and wrong. But if you let that condition stay in place long enough, you get to right becomes the good. And the opposite of good is bad. And this kind of moral language is a bit different. Now you have a differentiator here. Because right and wrong, that's about guilt. You've done something wrong. You're guilty of doing something wrong. But good and bad, this is about identity. This is shame. You are bad. You can do something that's wrong. Guilt, that's the difference between guilt and shame. So your moral structure has elevated substantially. And given enough time, the good and bad framework can turn into good and evil. That's the top of this stack. Here's the thing. Sometimes the thing we consider evil is actually just unfamiliar. Now, please don't hear me say that all things that are evil are just based on unfamiliar. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that often we will call something evil that has been in our culture this idea has been in our culture for so long that we forgot that it was originally just unfamiliar. Now, I would suggest to you that the moral tone of this actually starts at this reasonable, unreasonable. That's where it begins. We begin to have these conversations around a culture, and things that are unreasonable are just quickly and summarily rejected. When you can get inside of a culture that has clearly defined good and evil, very often the people who consider themselves good will try to fix the people who are evil by doing things that are clearly evil. That's the problem. What examples? Most utopian societies go wrong in this way. They end up claiming to know the difference between good and evil so profoundly that they do things that we collectively have already agreed are evil. During the 80s, the 80s and 90s with the abortion debate, people called abortion so wrong, they called it evil, that they protested in ways that were evil. They started murdering abortion doctors. Now, those were extreme cases, but that's what that culture led to. In today's world, we're actually having arguments right now about our politics that are going the same direction. There are people standing at city council meetings who are calling the other side evil, or there are people standing in Congress who are calling the other side evil. We've come to this clarity where we're talking about good and evil in a way where we actually go to war with each other and do things that are evil. And often, surprisingly often, what we consider evil really has its origin in that which is unfamiliar. One of the things about doing culture change is that you've got to understand how far up this stack you've climbed. Sometimes you will present something that moves a culture towards healthy, moves it towards good, moves it towards better, and yet that culture has described that move as bad. That culture will have described any kind of change like that as bad or wrong or unreasonable. And that's what you have to consider when doing cultural change. You're coming against a set of resistance that has risen to and has a moral connotation to it. And it takes real work to sort of help that culture change and see and understand that you're not asking them to do something that is immoral, you're asking them to do something that is unfamiliar. To accomplish that, it is very helpful to consider the diffusion of innovation theory. If you're not familiar with the diffusion of innovation theory, Google it. It's fantastic. It's a body of work from, I believe, the 60s that has been written about at great length. But let me briefly just give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The diffusion of innovation theory suggests that innovation moves through a population along a bell curve. Innovation, or any kind of change, whether it's a technology, whether it's a trend, whether it's a fashion style, an art style, or a culture change, a conceptual change, will move through an organization in a particular way. And the first thing is there's a group out here that we call the innovators or the inventors. And the inventors are a very tiny part of the population, less than 1%. They're the people who invent these things, who think them up. They're not a very large group of people. They don't have a lot of social influence. They're not going to get change done. Then there's another group of people that we call the early adopters. Now, you've probably heard that word before. And early adopters are paying attention to what the inventors are working on, and they extract an idea. They're like, that's a good idea, because inventors have all kinds of crazy ideas. They try all kinds of stuff. Most of it doesn't work and doesn't go anywhere. But the early adopters will come along and go, that's a fabulous idea. Let's try that one. The early adopters are the people who will pay too much. for the thing. When the iPhone first came out, these were the people who would wait in line for days, set up camp in front of the Apple Store, and then pay way too much, according to the rest of us, for the new technology. But they see themselves as the people that are going to go adopt these new technologies. They're going to adopt them early, and they're going to test them. They're going to check them out. They want to do that work. It's kind of their role in the world. Some people are early adopters with technology. Some do it with fashion. Others do it with ideas. So it depends on the segment or the industry or the category, whether or not you're an early adopter or not. Personally, I'm not an early adopter with technology. I'm probably part of the early majority. But with conceptual ideas, sometimes I am. Now, the early adopters are going to pay attention to the inventors, and they're going to adopt the technology and thing. Now, the next group is called the early majority. And what they're doing is they're paying close attention to what these folks are up to. And they're going to watch what they're adopting. And they're going to decide, should we bring it into the mainstream? This is the beginning of mainstream adoption. And then, of course, the next group is called the late majority. And they pay attention to what this group is adopting. And this group is called the laggards. And so everybody's paying attention to the group in front of them to see if they should adopt it. Now, the laggards are an interesting group because they don't want to adopt it at all. The only way they're going to adopt this technology or conceptual change or cultural change is if they're forced to, if they have to. And they will resist a lot. Now, I actually think there's a little group on the end. This isn't part of the original theory, but this little group on the end is called the saboteurs. And sometimes they circle back around and they start to rattle cages as this thing is almost wrapping up. You've just about got it done, and then the saboteur will show up. And they mean to do harm. They mean to bring the whole thing down if they have to in order to prevent the change from occurring. Here's the idea that we learned from this in doing cultural change. As a change is moving through an organization, you need to identify who your early adopters are. And you need to work with them. The early adopters are the ones that are going to adopt the change before it's really ready. And they're going to help you make it ready for the early majority. They're going to figure out its weaknesses. They're going to help you test it and implement it. And they're going to be advocates. And when they get it to a place where it's actually functional, the early majority is going to start paying attention. And when the early majority has some critiques or questions or concerns or resistance, or they're like, this is just more work, I don't want to make this change, the early adopters are the one that are going to help you say, no, it really does work, check it out. And we need to know who those people are. They are your advocates, and they're going to help you spread this change across your organization. What we think is true is that if you can get the early adopters to transition the cultural change into the beginnings of the early majority, something around this far into it, the change becomes inevitable. However, if the early majority will not adopt the change, it'll never happen. Lots of great products, lots of great innovations, lots of meaningful change have died right here because it can't cross into the early majority. Once this happens, there's a swell, and it just it's not like it's easy yet, but it becomes inevitable that it'll just make its way through the organization. By the time it gets into the late majority, the laggards have to. They just can't get away from it. It's also been vetted and proved that this actually does work. It actually is helpful. Here's what's going on with cultural innovation. In the beginning, when you're starting to make change and you're bringing change into your organization, it's going to be received as bad, even if it's good. If you're making change that moves outside of the realm of your relative normal, the culture itself will go, I don't know about that, and it will put up resistance. Along the way, your laggards and your late majority are going to resist you. Don't feed that energy. You don't want to ignore them. They get a voice, but don't try to solve their problems until the change has made its way into the early majority. Because at that point, the idea will have been integrated into your culture, and it'll start to take the shape, have the smell, the aroma of your culture. And that's what it takes for your late majority to start to adopt it. And that's what it takes for your laggards to finally go, fine, we'll do the thing. There's lots of examples written up in all kinds of books about how this works. You can probably think of some from your own experience. The purpose of this video is to show you that when doing cultural change, you want to understand that all change by a culture is received as bad. If the culture is well enough established, it will view things that are just unfamiliar as unreasonable, possibly wrong, maybe even bad. In some contexts, it even becomes evil. And when you're trying to do change, You got to know that you're up against that kind of structure, that kind of thinking. Then you have to do this work with your early adopters to build advocates, to build language and understanding about why this is going to be hard, but worth it. That's the key. I love drawing these whiteboard pictures for you, and if you like them too, the best way to let us know is to hit that subscribe button and the like button. It really helps spread the word of what we're doing here at Icon Coaching. What's even better is if you get a hold of us. Go to iconcoaching.com, that's ikoncoaching.com, click the button, and you'll get right through to us via email or phone, and we can chat about how this stuff applies to your company.